Okay, well, hello everybody. Thank you again for the very kind introduction, and delighted to share my thoughts on these 2 days theme of digital curations. What I'd like to do in my presentation this morning is reflect on 2 projects. So you'll notice the reference to Iran and to Italy, which have been 2 projects I've been involved with over the last 10 years. So the first part of my presentation, I'm going to just briefly introduce the rationale of threading together 2 projects. I'm going to then jump into brief overviews of the Iran project and then the Italy project, and then work towards a conclusion on the implications for these themes of digital curation, multimodal possibilities, and also this idea of ethnographies across borders, which is again another central thread in my work. So to begin with, just a very brief overview of my research profile and interests. Over the past decade, I've been working on issues relating to digital and visual practices. So from photography and popular photographic practices before and during the advent and development of social media. So really looking at both analog practices and kind of, working in the area of the scholarship in that field in anthropology, but then how it intersects with the social media forms that we've come to know today. So then, pre-Instagram and during, if you like. And this relates to my PhD work, which was about popular photography in Iran, particularly looking at photo blogging. So this was a period, as I said, before the era of Instagram and Snapchat and these kinds of platforms, really looking at how young people in Iran, as well as in the diaspora and transnationally online, were using photography as vehicles for digital visual communication, self-representation, collaboration, discussion, and reflection. So this study of popular photography was carried out in part in Iran, but also online and in the UK amongst diaspora in the UK as well. And then moving into my second project, which was my postdoctoral project undertaken at UCL with the ASSA collective, the ASSA group, the Anthropology of Smartphones and Smart Aging. I was really with a team of colleagues studying the role of the smartphone in several countries and social, economic, political contexts around the world. For this, I was based in Milan, Italy, in a neighbourhood, in an urban neighbourhood, inner city neighbourhood, working in a very kind of super diverse context with people from lots of different backgrounds, particularly working with research participants from Egypt and Afghanistan. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that later on today. So the threads between all of these things kind of are, an interest in the ethnographic everyday, in visual technologies, in relationship between images, visibility, and power, collaboration and multimodal storytelling, because the topics were very much linked to the methods, and I was very conscious of drawing a link between the theoretical approaches we bring to our research and the methods and as linked to the epistemology. So I've been very passionate about working and developing methodologies over my career, because I feel that they are the very core of the how we do research, the how in this case we do ethnography. And so so just to give examples that all of this work since 2012 has culminated in these publications as these main publications, in addition to others, looking at these kinds of themes and threads. So again, as part of the final point of my sort of introduction to my talk is, just kind of highlighting why, like our convener said in the introduction to our workshop, the importance, the stakes, if you like, of working in these multimodal ways, not just because they're fun and they're engaging and visually stimulating and creative and we enjoy them, but actually because these are the ways in which people are effectively communicating, living, worrying, caring, and just being human today. And so I must say that my research in digital and visual anthropology did not come from a kind of pre-existing inclination necessarily to become a digital anthropologist. My own path in this, as indeed the development of the field itself, has come out of a response to the realities of life around the world, and the need to develop our tools, our approaches, and our perspectives accordingly to engage with those. So I'm really kind of going to be talking about, the unfolding role of digital, visual, and multimodal research. Particularly, obviously, I'm an anthropologist, so particularly for ethnographic research, but generally, as I mentioned, bringing together methods with the epistemological focus on the nature of the kind of knowledge production we can do, limits of collaboration, as well as the exciting potentials, and so on. So very briefly, I'm going to be talking about very briefly about my former project, which I've spoken about before, and it's been a while since that project was completed in 2015. But I'm bringing it up in this talk as a sort of comparative piece to see what has changed over this 10-year span in which these two projects played out and I was involved with them. What technologies have changed, what approaches have changed, what are the key differences? So the reason, if you like, for looking backwards, a little bit historical example at past research is, as I said, to try and attempt to bring out those points. And, one of the points I'd like to raise, maybe we'll come back to this in discussion, is, there's this saying, old wine in new bottles. Or is that the case with multimodal technologies and approaches? Or is it new wine in very new bottles? So it's that kind of a thing I'm interested in drawing out, the similarities and the differences, the continuities and the changes. So briefly, to look back at previous research, so photoblogging in and of Iran, so both within the country, but of Iran in terms of Iran as subject of photographic practice. This was very much rooted in a study of urban youth cultures and what people were doing with their time in around the 2010, 11, 12 onwards period. So in a very particular media moment, a political moment, it's obviously, like all research, rooted in time and place and politics. This was a study of amateur photography, so not particularly working with photojournalists or professionals, but really young people, university graduates or people with day jobs in their 20s and 30s who were taking images and then uploading them to these photoblog sites. So these are, if we remember, these are Tumblrs, these are older websites and forms for communicating and sharing images. This is Flickr, but it's also kind of slightly before Flickr as well. Certainly before, as I mentioned, Instagram or anything like that. So the background was about an interest in the representation of Iran in the mediascapes, in the geopolitical arena, in the political narratives and discourse coming from the West, from the UK, the US, countries that have very, very difficult and tense relationships with Iran and vice versa. But then really, in the middle of all of this, how do we situate kind of everyday image making as a site of articulation of dialogue? Because these images are there to be seen. They're there to show and tell, in the words of Anna Grimshaw. They are there to communicate. So who were they communicating to? And I was looking at Western-based viewers in Europe, in America, in different countries across the Middle East, and then trying to understand what these young photobloggers were trying to communicate about their lives and their country and so on. some publications around that time and since that have shown interest in these kinds of topics relating to media practices, relating to Iran, that I've been, reading and working with and dialoguing with, include some of the following: work on blogs, the internet, and diaspora experiences as well. My own work was very much about, therefore, the everyday, envisaging the everyday images, right? If you'd like, the mundane, the banal. So I have an interest in what I call banal aesthetics in one of my publications, and the kind of soft politics of photo blogging. And this is also linked to a methodological and epistemological interest in moving away from the kind of knowledge production that produces hot topics, exotic interests, reorientalizing our interest in countries in the Middle East, particularly Iran, of which, has its own particular history of being in many ways isolated from the international community for various reasons. So the ethnographic perspective is really chiming with the work of Asaf Bayat, for example, as looking at the ordinariness of life, the non-movements as much as the social movements, and so on. So really it was about, at that time, the particular media technologies of using camera phones. These are just before smartphones, so camera phone technologies, to show the everydayness and what many refer to as a kind of truth. So a subjective truth about the country, about the realities, as opposed to, as I said, these other regimes of knowledge production about the place. And so I really situate my work, if you like, in the middle of this nexus between, as I mentioned, professional photography and popular photography on the one hand, and on the other axes, we have kind of media and photography practices, competitions, and so on in the West, and Iranian sort of official activities, organizations, clubs, and societies. So how do photobloggers kind of occupy space and mediate between all of these areas and in their practices and the implications of that? So the methodological quandaries really relate first and foremost to this question of access and presence inside, a country where it's difficult for certain people to undertake research. And so the challenges of doing anthropology in the country is something that, obviously had to take very seriously and consider. And is what Hegland calls a professional dilemma for anthropologists, hoping to do that kind of research. So one of the things I was thinking about was, what I call being where, where am I in this research? Do I have to just be, on the ground in the country in which I'd like to do some research? Or if that's not possible, how can I draw on, the visual, the digital, the multimodal methodologies to configure a sense, an experiential and methodological sense of being in the field that would be anthropologically ethical, sound, efficacious, is that word? Efficient? Would it work? Had all these questions in my mind. And this involves two key ideas: conceiving of place beyond geographical location, and thinking through, as I mentioned, potentials of things like digital curation. So this is just some of the kind of ways I've been thinking about place, as intersection, as Tim Cresswell talks about, or as far more than location, but actually a site of encounter. And so at the time in 2012, I looked to, I looked around me what other kind of work was trying to also foster some humane, everyday understandings about Iran at that time through art projects, through, writing, through various other kinds of ways, if not, on the ground, full ethnography. And I came across some digital media art-based projects. For example, this one between Iran and the US, whereby an artist based in Tehran, Sohrab Kashani, was collaborating with the artist John Rubin in the States, and they were facilitating live kind of Skype facilitated dinners between people in one location and the other in order to foster discussion, joy, curiosity, sharing, and obviously food being central to all of those things. It was a kind of a live co-present dinner project. Another one that I found out about during my research period of that time was the Shared Studios project, which was a digital portal developed between Tehran and New York, in which individuals in both cities were who were taking part were invited to step into a kind of portal digital, live linked box with a screen where they could essentially, again, share time, have a chat, a kind of coffee chat, and just kind of talk to people in another country, but not any old country. I must underline that these two projects were actively trying to challenge the sharp divisions, the geopolitical divisions between these places that was going on at these political levels through more kind of human based learning, discussion, and encounters, I would say, that might not be possible if physical presence, travel, and so on both sides, due to, on the one hand, things like sanctions, but also due to the limitations on certain types of travelers, was not possible. So in light of all of this, I was kind of looking around, thinking, imagining. I set up one of the first things I did myself was to set up a research photo blog to explore, when I managed to visit the country for a very limited period of time, I could set up a blog to sort of introduce who I was to anyone, who was wondering, and obviously keep research participants to outline who I was, my project, where I was based at my university, and what my intentions were. I thought this was extremely important for many reasons, for ethical reasons, for safety reasons. And so, yeah, I kind of put everything on this blog to share, and sort of, and as a way of connecting with people and also recruiting kind of participants in the study, set up a research photo blog in terms of, I became a photo blogger, a sort of an amateur photo blogger, to join the community as per ethnographic, methodologies. And this is where I get to the curatorial in the most literal sense, is that I set up a collaborative pursuit to set up a photoblog exhibition, an online digital exhibition, later in the research. So obviously not from the beginning when I hadn't done much yet, but later, once I'd connected with people, once I'd established a way of working online through email, through Skype, through various kinds of digital visual ways. The idea was to collaborate with key research participants in which they would share images from their photo blogs onto the digital exhibition for introducing, providing descriptions, providing links back to their own original photo blogs. But it was really, I envisaged this as a very much a research space for discussion, encounter, collaboration, obviously not necessarily all at once. So this was not entirely always live co-presence due to time differences, due to availability differences. So again, the kind of limits of collaboration need to be kind of addressed here. But it was there, it was at first password protected. So during the development stage, we could kind of go in a more private way and edit, think things through, change things around, but essentially, ultimately, became a public URL link with everyone's permission to share with not generally or randomly, of course, but share as we intended, share very particular sharing to particular communities of audiences that we felt might be interested in to engage with it. So this was on the one hand, people I met during in the diaspora in the UK that were already part of the wider research on this topic I was doing, that I already knew and were well aware of the research, so sharing these with them. On the photobloggers side, they were sharing it with their friends, their their own collaborators, also exhibition curators, artists, journalists in the UK that were also variously interested in the project, and also variously not interested in the project, I must say, because this was a very humble digital exhibition, not at all particularly sophisticated in terms of the technologies or in terms of the interface, because the point was that wasn't the point, if you like. That wasn't the point. The point was about the relationships, about the images, about the discussions. And so, yeah, it was what it was. I wouldn't say it was the most as I said, particularly digitally sophisticated exhibition, and it was of its time, but it very much helped me and felt like a very relevant way of working for that project. Now, of course, the issues of digital divides, issues to do with the economic situation, the telecommunications industry, the Wi-Fi connections, all of these factors, of course, play a part in the ways that one can digitally curate between, the UK and Iran in this case, or in any other case. As we all know, the infrastructures play a massive role in the practical and political realities of digital curation or any kind of multimodal research. So this is something that, we encountered, we worked with, we worked around, and it was very just much part of the picture. I was inspired a lot by the methodologies of mobility studies at the time, reading about how blogs were sites of kind of transnational connection and kind of world making, around the world. I was thinking about types of being there. So if you really can't be with people, sitting around with them physically, and this was, this was many years ago in the sense, in digital terms. So this was pre the world of living under lockdown with digital technologies in many cases embedded in everything we do. So there was a sort of unease about whether this indeed constituted kind of ethnographic research because of its presumed shortcomings. But pushing beyond those kinds of those ideas, I was really inspired by fellow colleagues' work on thinking about the imaginative potentials of multimodal ethnography and the potentials of visual and digital methods, curating digital exhibitions, working online, offline, kind of all of the things that I'm sure we're going to be talking about over the next 2 days, over the last 8 to 10 years have been building up. And I'm really excited by the work that I've been lucky to be a part of in this area. And so to sum up that kind of that digital exhibition from that time, it culminated in a series of publications, including one in visual ethnography about the anthropologist as curator in this sense. So you're assembling people together in an online space, you're exploring themes and issues through this encounter, you're critiquing and reworking your own research questions and your presumptions about the research through this act of collaboration and discussion and critical reflexivity. Disseminating to research publics, of course, a really big part of it, as we heard this morning from the introduction, big part of multimodal methods is disseminating and sharing. Seeing it as a virtual HQ, a headquarters or a contact zone, to borrow the term from James Clifford, of encounter of multiple kinds, thinking about the interactive and participatory nature of of the exhibition as a kind of operational archive, because you're creating as you go along. And this exhibition has now since been archived. It's no longer live. It's had its time in the live sense, but it's been archived with my university library, and it forms part of that kind of artifact of the research of that time and place. And the idea of decentralized curation is why I put the sort of co-curatorial as a framework to discuss. And this then led to further spin-off projects in recent years. So another thing I was interested in doing from my PhD project was try to understand how we can then work with things like social media as kind of the ways in which people themselves are co-curating all the time the kinds of images and self-representations, desires, memories that they want to share. So this was a project that I worked on shortly after the completion of my PhD as part of a wider project called Abadan Retold by Rasmus Elling at the University of Copenhagen. And I joined briefly onto the project as a kind of independent researcher, spinning off, as I said, my PhD work that looked at the social memory of residents of the city of Abadan in southwest Iran, which became the site and front of the Iran-Iraq war in the 1980s, and how residents of this community, which then migrated and left, through a kind of forced displacement and left all kind of corners of the world and other places in Iran since. The recreation of the city community online through social media pages relating specifically to Abadan, and the kinds of images that were being shown from people's childhoods, but then obviously linking to the ongoing everyday politics and realities of the city today, post-revolution, post-economic transformation. So what, linking past, present. So that one of the things the multimodal is doing here is constantly blending and blurring conceptions of time and space, because you have a lot of people in the States and around the world engaging with these sites from their various perspectives and vantage points. I will move to the next project now, the latest project I've worked on between 2017 and 20, studying aging and smartphones and health in Italy. I mentioned this was part of a project based at UCL with colleagues on the ASSA project, in which we all spent 16 months in various field sites around the world. So you can see that visualized on this map here. It's a European Research Council funded project. Daniel Miller was the PI of this project, and this follows a former project of his and other colleagues working on social media some years beforehand. But this project in particular was aiming to investigate the relationship between age and health, particularly in relation to the smartphone. So how people are growing older with the smartphone as technological change is rapidly advancing. I mentioned I was based in Milan, Italy, and so my book on this topic is really much addressing these questions, as I mentioned, that the project was looking at, but particularly with my own focus on migration, looking at the digital city and transnational living. My book, one of the main methodologies I kind of propose is urban digital ethnography as a way of doing urban, sort of conventional, if you like, established urban ethnographic research, and working in context of super diversity and all the established ways of working, drawing on all of that inspiration and approach. But then what does that then look like when you are doing urban ethnography, but you're spending hours of your day on your smartphone doing research in WhatsApp groups and so on, and the intersecting of the offline online. So I mentioned, what I was physically doing, spending this much time in Milan, participating in community groups, women's groups, choir groups, social spaces, NGOs, trying to really establish myself, as a resident of the community, and meeting people and trying to, undertake this research in that context as carefully as possible. I was inspired, again, you know, linking method to topic, as always. I was really inspired by the ways in which researchers in many, many fields, you know, from anthropology to visual communication to arts, are using multimodal kind of methods to communicate the research findings. And so, you know, the positive negatives collective based in London is one area, is one group that have been working a lot with humanitarian issues. They do ethnographic research with people in all kinds of contexts of life, and they work with professional illustrators to illustrate the drawings of the findings, and they have this very engaging multimodal website that they share all of this research on, together with description, context, bibliographies, links relating to the issues that they're depicting and sharing. The Illustrating Anthropology exhibition as well by colleagues, Laura Harpier-Kirk and Jennifer Carnes, was also an online exhibition, digital exhibition, sharing the drawings of ethnographic research findings from various scholars working around the world. So, you know, inspired by various kinds of approaches, I was wondering, well, how can, you know, I was wondering collectively, I must say, in my project team, we were wondering how, you know, the research that we were doing offline, but also online with smartphones, these in-depth interviews and all of the things we were doing could be then, you know, communicated, the depth of all of that could be communicated online through our own project website, you know, our own way of sharing short videos, films, drawings, illustrations. So to give an example, we created a series of comics as a way, as a commitment to our kind of public anthropology rationale of the project in the first place. The ASSA project was very much from the onset trying to engage with publics beyond the academy as well, within and beyond. So this comic was created illustrated by the artist John K. Douglas, scripted by colleagues on the project, Laura Harpier-Kirk and Georgiana Mariaou. And it was based on my research, so on my research findings, on key characters in the ethnography, key stories and anecdotes, and real ethnographic vignettes. So we see here the case study of Heba, who is a woman originally from Alexandria in Egypt, but lives in Milan with her children, and is extremely busy, living a life, you know, working full time, taking the children to school, just living the everyday life of a woman of her age in that particular context that she's in, but then living a very transnational life as well. So kind of caring for her aging mother, who has diabetes and health problems back home in Egypt. And then sort of, you know, this is an example of what scholars have called the so-called sandwich generation. So where particularly women, but not exclusively, are caring upwards to aging parents and downwards to younger dependents and children, and kind of they're sandwiched in the middle. But then what does it look like when you bring the sandwich analogy to the transnational framework as well, and the various complicated lines of care and connectivity? So this comic is trying to, in a kind of slightly jovial sense, communicate the joys and of life, but also where points of seriousness and challenge and difficulty puncture you know, how we understand how someone lives, you know, so particularly when a WhatsApp message can come through and puncture your day with a series of obligations, responsibilities, worries, anxieties, and so on. So our website is a real multimodal space for sharing all the 10 field sites. We have comics from several different country contexts in several different languages as well. So that was really, really eye-opening experience. I mentioned particular communities I was working with. So the Hazara community from Afghanistan I came to know and work with during my research and collaborate with in various different ways. And this is an ethnic community that are heavily persecuted in their home country in Afghanistan, and has led to a significant diaspora and refugee community in Europe, but all over the world. And so, you know, working with Hazara, that Hazara people I met in Milan brought me into the fields of actually cultural production, filmmaking. This is one, for example, that I came to know by the filmmaker Amin Wahidi, who I came to meet in Milan. It's about a story of Hazara refugee in Italy, in Venice, and his story and journey from Afghanistan to Italy, and the realities of being Hazara in Italy at this time. Another one, Sembra mio figlio, just like my son, is another story. What these two films mark some of the very first stories to tell Hazara stories in the Italian context. So these are from, you know, 2018 time, and actually has been since put on one of the main TV channels, RAI in Italy since. So these stories are coming across, and the reason I mention them is my role again as kind of, you know, anthropologist, ethnographer, as friend in this context as well, was to work as translator, as, you know, as collaborator. I was, you know, helping to translate some of the poetry and some of the introductions to the films that were screened across Milan at that time, between English, Italian, and sometimes also communicating in Persian and the Dari language. And so, you know, the anthropologist as curator, the anthropologist as translator, variously shifting roles in order to, you know, foster creative ways of working with people that is not just about interviews, and is not just about kind of the more conventional methods. And once I'd engaged in these methodologies, it brought me into more areas that then linked back to the research, which is things like transnational family groups and how people are communicating online, and again, all of the love and joy and humor of that, with all the seriousness and the gravity of, as I mentioned, being, you know, subject to extreme violence and suffering as well back home in the country, and also other kinds of violence in the European context as well. I've realized I've kind of run over time. I will conclude now, just to kind of reflect on this idea of the potentials of the multimodal digital co-curating. And I like this quote from Povinelli that writes about the future already among us. It's here, you know, it's not going anywhere, it's only transforming ever still. So the idea that we can continue to think through how we collectively curate, mediate, communicate worlds, whilst those worlds are already doing the same, begs the question about our positionality, our roles, the limits of our roles, potentials and challenges of doing this kind of work. And so I think the multimodal possibilities and futures are very exciting about thinking through the different ways of doing research in anthropology, but also across the different fields, across social sciences and humanities, as better ways of learning and knowing together, as I take these points here from this article. And all of this, I think, at the biggest level, to finally conclude, leads to what Anand Pandian thinks about a changing and possible anthropology. So again, speaking through to my own discipline here, but thinking about this as less the study of culture as an understanding, as these fixed ways of representing realities that are fixed, but actually understanding the cultivation of humanity as nothing but a method of change, adaptation, development, reflexivity, and renewal. So I'll end there, and thank you so much for your attention, and I really look forward to your questions and comments.